Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good
Hoy
afternoon here. Today in this fourth Culture Forum organized in Burgos, we are running the second conversation, a conversation which I think is very interesting, where we'll be talking about the connection between development and food sovereignty. And in order to do that, we have two great guests, two great researchers and disseminators, popularizers in the respective areas of knowledge. We have Vandana Shiva, extremely well known by many of those watching the chat. She's a physicist, a philosopher. She was born in India, and she has taught us a lot about ecofeminism. And the other side of the screen, we also have Carl Safina. Carl is an ecologist. He was born in the US. He is a specialist in the behavior of non-human animals. In other words, he is an ethologist. Now, these two perspectives seem to me very interesting in order to address the topic of our conversation, a topic that I would like to approach stealthily, as it were, silently from a distance, so that the conversation, so that at the end of the conversation, both guests will evaluate or assess this connection between food sovereignty and development. But in order to get slowly started, my first comment, my first suggestion, and again, knowing that we are speaking from, or you are speaking from two different continents, I would like to ask you about your take on, or your analysis of the distance that this Western society, this capitalist society, keeps currently with nature. There's talk about the fact that many children in industrialized countries are living or suffering from some kind of condition that is already being termed nature deficit. But we also know that from our everyday experience of buying food, for example, how many consumers really do not know what the seasonal products are, for example. So that gap, that distance between the human beings and nature, how would you cope with that? How would you interpret that from your respective angles, continents, and disciplines? And what connection do you think there is with the loss and disappearance of the country, of the farmers' fabric, with the ignorance of with the lack of prestige of the rural world in urban societies, and whether this has been a central, a key factor in what we see now as a problem, is again this distance between human beings and the rest of living beings. Perhaps, Vandana, you can start if you agree.
I think that the distance and separation between nature and human beings is a very deep construct of colonialism. And around the time of colonialism, around the time the East India Company was being created, the intellectual architecture was also being created. Central to it were people like Bacon, who were not just called the father of modern science, but he was the chancellor. And he wrote a book called The Masculine Birth of Time. And he basically mimicked his idea of knowledge on the interrogation of witches, that you have to torture nature. And the idea that nature and we have a relationship he defined as effeminate. He also defined women with knowledge as witches, as that period of Europe was. And the fact that the countryside has been defined as backward is part of this separation, a very artificial separation between nature and humans and mind and matter. And then some white superior men have minds and no one else does. We are purely bodies to be exploited, women's bodies to be exploited, farmers' bodies to be exploited, workers' bodies to be exploited, indigenous people's bodies to be exploited, Black people's bodies to be exploited as slaves. And this now has come to the extreme where you talked about nature deficit disorder among children. But I think the big mental disorder in industrial society and colonizing society is a denialism of nature. There's a lot of talk of denialism, climate design, denialism, that denial. But the denialism of nature and her living processes is the deepest denial, which has led to the pandemic, which has led to the chronic diseases that make the pandemic worse, which has led to climate change, which has led to species extinction, and has led to hunger and the crisis of people not being able to eat the food that brings health, not just to human beings, but all beings, because in my work now, after all these decades, I find that food is the currency of life. And when food is nourishing, then it nourishes all of life. The same mindset of a separation from nature and defeating Mother Nature. You read the literature of the Googles and the Microsofts. In the last 5 years, they've all created life sciences divisions. They're all entering the food system. Bill Gates has a new Gates Ag one agriculture without farmers, farming without farmers, digital agriculture, food without food in the labs. So they have a dystopian vision that is in such deep denialism of the processes of life, of the integrity of food, the links between food and health, and that real food has to be produced in the countryside by real farmers. So these are the deep ontological questions of our time, and they hinge on the future of the human species. And how we answer them and how we address them will decide whether we'll be around as a species or not.
Okay, so I don't disagree with any of Vandana's analysis there, but I have a slightly overlapping, I guess, perspective, some different things. I don't really think that the problem is colonial. I think it's much deeper than that. The colonizing cultures were basically the Western culture, the European culture. And I think this culture doesn't just harm what it colonizes, it does the same things in its own regions. It's a structure of power and the abuse of power. It is not a structure of community and the idea that in a community we all help one another and that we are part of the living community of life on Earth, or that we are part of the community of human beings. It's a fractured and atomized sense of the world in which, in order to win, you must make someone lose. These are pathologies, I think. I don't think they're a basic part of the human mind or the human spirit. And for many thousands of years, most cultures, and I would say all indigenous cultures, were based entirely on community and a reverential view of nature, not a view of nature as an enemy or something to be destroyed, not a view of people within your own community or your own country as some things to be exploited and then cast aside. Unfortunately, as a Westerner, I see that that is a basic premise of Western society and Western culture. It's not shared by everyone. There are many of us who are completely set against that, but we are going through an election in the United States in which we basically see that at least half the people in the country are enthusiastic proponents of the idea that in order to win, you must make someone lose, and that there are enemies within your own communities, instead of seeing that your community is one collection of individuals that all win by helping one another. It seems to me that the deeper roots of the Western relationship with nature specifically go back to the underlying premise of the Abrahamic religions, which do not see nature as something to be revered. They see a totally detached kind of a God who is very interested in individual human beings, but not in the upkeep of the natural world. a timeline that is linear instead of circular, not something that revolves around seasons, but something that just puts a pin in a timeline and starts counting from there, which really unmoors us from a real sense of time and events on Earth. And your premise has a lot to do with this, the idea, as you said, of the distance between people and the natural world. In one sense, there's an enormous gap, an enormous distance, because most people live without really considering nature and the natural world at all. But in another sense, we couldn't possibly be closer to it because we're not just ignoring it, we are destroying it. All of the habitats on Earth are at their most degraded and smallest extent than they ever have been in the history of human existence. And that's because of us, and it's mostly because of us in the last couple of thousand years, and especially since the Industrial Revolution. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there are simply far, far, far too many people in the world. There are many people who say we could make enough food for 10 billion, 20 billion people. Even if that's factually true, all those people need water. All those people want wood. They all want the dignity that comes with having opportunities and some room to breathe. They need to eat something, and eating something requires land, and land is taken from every other living thing on Earth. And the accelerating pressures of human population have been almost insuperable, almost impossible to cope with. As we recognize the problems that we are creating, our solutions must intensify just to stay in place. And that has made things very difficult. So those are some of my thoughts on it.
No sé si Vandana.
I wonder if perhaps, Vandana, if any time you want to complete Carl's analysis, you're welcome.
So two things, sitting in India, which was the country for which the British colonialism was created, after all, otherwise why would the company be called East India Company? I definitely feel there's a huge mutation in the way the West related to the rest of the world. In fact, it didn't relate to the rest of the world before that. It's really the first wave of globalization as trade-based was with the East India Company, and the first free trade agreement was written by the East India Company by bribing a clerk in the Mughal Emperor so that they didn't have to pay taxes and they could have military protection, etc. But I have watched how the Abrahamic religions have themselves mutated under the pressure of commerce. And I know there was a friend of mine writing about how the interpretation of the Bible constantly kept changing to fit, just like the idea of knowledge kept changing to fit with the imperialistic extractivist idea. The very idea of religions changed. But I also read a lot of, just the other day I was releasing a book which had multi-faith writings from Islam, from Christianity, from Judaism, the most beautiful writings about how they see nature. It's just that part has got submerged.
What is the title of that book? I'd love to share the title of that book.
It's written by an ecologist and a theologian in Australia. And Carl, I'm going to make sure that I get the title later. I'm not as smart as you to be able to do a Zoom and an email. I can.
That may make you smarter than me. I think that makes you smarter.
I will definitely send it to you.
Please do. Please.
I'm also thinking of the fact that here was colonialism, and they rewrote the role of the church with the papal bull of 1493, after Columbus set sail, 1492. The papal bull basically declared all of us who were a little different as barbarians, just like the women of Europe had been defined as witches, to be exterminated, to be wiped out. But the encyclical of the current Pope is basically saying everything we are saying, that we are part of nature, We are not separate, that the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth are the same cry. So there's a overcoming of that constructive divide. On the issue of the population question, I have a book called The Earth Democracy, where I've addressed this question. So India has kept village statistics for very, very, very long. And our population was totally stable till 1815. Now, 1757 is when the East India Company takes over Bengal. 1815 is when they change the land records and they make themselves the owners and they appoint landlords to extract rent. This led to a transfer of $45 trillion to England and left 60 million peasants starving. But after 1815, the population starts to increase because people who lived on the land now no more have the land to live on, they were dispossessed. And my research has shown that when you're dispossessed and all you have is body, you know, not the land. So as long as you're on the land, you have a relationship of balance. And the family stay 2, 3 within the reproductive stage. You're uprooted, populations start to grow. Because now you're vulnerable, you don't have security. And as the population book said, asked, you know, when they asked the poor peasant, the landless peasant, why do you have so many kids? And this peasant of Punjab said, well, the landlord can buy his next tractor. I can only have the next kid. This is our instrument of production. And the same phenomena is the case when the highlands of Scotland were enclosed for sheep, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And you remember those books called Sheep Eat Men? But the highland clearances led to a population explosion, which is why the Scots moved to Nova Scotia. They always had another place to move to. And all of that instability of the population has the other side today, where in the rich countries, there is no reproduction. You know, I was reading a piece on Japan, how there are no children being born. Even in Italy, children aren't being born. So we are in a dual crisis of the poor are having to have more children just to survive, and the better off can't afford children because the cost of living is so high. Yeah. So I think we need to build into the population discussion, not just a static relationship, but these colonial interventions, as well as the fact that, you know, your cost of living can go so high that you can't afford to have the next generation of children. Remember the double income, no kids families that was starting? And then because our bodies are the raw material, there was an explosion over the last 20 years, which has been stopped, I think, right now, of surrogate mothers, where wombs were rented in India because the people were too busy in America to stop their very profitable legal practice or their medical practice or making their billions. So they'd hire a womb. And so I think the population discussion should really be through the body. It should be through the issues of consumption and definitely the issues of the pressures of the land. And my own work over the last 30 years has shown that if you work non-violently with the earth, realizing you're part of the earth, and you grow biodiversity, which is what I do, we grow more food on less land. On 1 acre, you can feed a family of 6. And therefore 1 acre is not too small. In fact, you get more the minute you get big. You stop doing agriculture as care for the land. You stop growing food as nourishing. You start growing commodities. And that's why the United States grows huge amounts of commodities, but they go for biofuel and animal feed. And even in rich America, they're food deserts. Yeah. And with the COVID lockdown, look at the queues for food. Yeah. So our relationship with nature being broken also is a broken relationship with food.
Me gustaría que profundizarais.
I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on this anthropocentrism that is linked to farming, which is quite evident from my point of view in the industrialization of nature that has taken place. In other words, we have felt We felt that we had the right to ill-treat the land and the earth, not just not feel part of it, but even feel like we are above it, feel powerful, without no kind of respect for the land and for earth. You were saying that we are part of nature. Really, a human being is made up of 1,000 other living creatures. Our bioma is equivalent to the bioma of, or the amount of germs and microbia and living beings that we can find in a little portion of fertile land. I'm concerned with the new progress made in farming. Vandana, you mentioned that, pushed by people like the owner of Windows, Bill Gates. I'm concerned over that technological agriculture and its advance, this digitized agriculture, this intelligence, so-called smart farming, against the background of climate change. And I am concerned insofar as it strengthens that imaginary where human beings do not belong to nature, not to mention what it means in terms of lack of acknowledgement for the farmer's wisdom. I wonder, Carl, you live in the US. I wonder, this expansion of this model of digitized farming, including things like sensors, robots, whether you see this as another turn of the screw.
Of course. I mean, how could you see it other? Every time humans are removed from any kind of production or any way of making a living or being business owners in their community, we are literally dehumanizing the world and the economy. We've gone in the United States anyway from what we used to call family farms, which were just that, to industrial agriculture where people used big machines and there were far fewer people per unit of production or per area of land, a lot of chemical inputs and that kind of thing. And this is just an acceleration of that same trend, and the trend destroys communities. I don't see anything at all good about it. It's just it's a further separator between people and any reasonable understanding of life on Earth, but it's also a way of destroying people and destroying communities, to take from them the opportunity to make a living. I think an economy should have as its main goal to employ the largest number of people in all the different things that are going on, not to remove as many people as possible from everything that's going on. With a few, I would make a few exceptions, extremely dangerous jobs, things like that, and some things that human beings cannot do alone. A human being cannot dig a well at the bottom of the ocean. You need a machine to do that. You need a machine to do various things. But there are many, many things where humans have been replaced by machines, and that process has largely accelerated. And I don't see anything good about it. Let me put it that way. I think we need to understand whether we want humans to exist in a business context or we want business to exist in a human context. I think that's really the basic question. I've never heard anybody quite ask that question.
So, as you mentioned, my background is physics, and agriculture was not what I had expected to spend most of my life on. But it's when Punjab, the land where I had studied my SC honors in particle physics, erupted in violence, I decided to look. And I was so surprised to see that they say productivity of agriculture is increasing and everyone thinks we have more food. No, productivity is measured by only measuring one input, labor. So the fewer people you have on the land, the more productive your agriculture is, even though you are per unit acre producing less nutrition, which is the work I do in assessing. And we can feed 2 times the world population by conserving biodiversity and employing everybody and not destabilizing rural communities. So productivity should be taking into account the fossil fuels used, the chemicals used, the capital that goes into it, the water that goes into it. And if you look at it in those terms, industrial agriculture is a negative economy. It uses 10 times more inputs than it produces, 10 times more water, 10 times more energy. It wouldn't exist if a farmer alone had to do it. It only exists because agribusiness has evolved an amazing way of taking our taxes and making it a subsidy. And recently there was a renewal of the cap in Europe, and there's been big protests around that because people want real food. People want to be able to protect nature. On the digital agriculture front, Monsanto was the first to start using these terms: precision agriculture, digital agriculture. Monsanto bought the Climate Corporation, which has data on climate, the biggest soil data corporation, Solum. And that's when I was writing my book, Oneness versus 1%, and I think it has been published in Spain. It definitely has been published in the US by Chelsea Green right now. And then meantime now, Monsanto's no more, it's been bought by Bayer, but who's pushing digital agriculture? It's Bill Gates. So we just did a new report, it's called The Gates to a Global Empire, where we have covered every sphere in which Bill Gates, pretending to do philanthropy, enters and carves out a huge territory. He's taking over the seeds of the world by making contributions to the seed banks, all in his hands now. The Ag 1 I mentioned. What does this mean? First, they can't create knowledge of farming. They mine the data from the very farmers to whom they will sell data as a commodity by locking farmers in to digital contracts. If you look, I love the way you call him owner of Windows, because that's what he is, you know. I mean, he didn't make anything, he just took an intellectual property on stuff that others had done, the basic, and he's doing that now. And he's taking intellectual property on fake food, 14 patents on the Impossible Burger. He is a patent maniac. And he's created a company called Editas to take patents on an untried technology, gene editing, which has so much unreliability, they call it precision. But for one gene you change, if you change 1,500 genes, that's not very precise. Nature works through an amazing balance of instant correlations, instant coherence, even quantum coherence at the level of the molecular organism. Living systems are so sophisticated in their complexity, their self-organization, their intelligence. And these clumsy tools of GMOs have already failed. Roundup resistance, Bt toxins have failed. Now he's bringing gene editing. And before the tools are ready, he's got the patents, Editas. And he manages to get the ladies he funded for pushing gene editing as a new technology, the Nobel. So that's how hugely orchestrated the knowledge system, the agriculture system, the food system is becoming in the hands of the technology barons. If you can't trust them with your communication, you definitely shouldn't trust them with your food. We need a whole new awakening on food sovereignty. And we need an awakening of what is knowledge of growing food and what is data mining. The two are very different. Microsoft and Gates is putting people in peasant homes to collect data so that 3 years later they will be able to sell the same data back, consolidated as big data. It is really reducing human beings to a data mine and life on Earth to a gene mine. And this is what this big, great reset of the World Economic Forum is all about. Take life out of life, take life out of nature. You are the new masters through digital technologies to financial control and financializing and commodifying everything.
It's very strange to me that this pathology is so successful in the world. I've never understood why anyone feels the urge to take over anything or anybody rather than to come to understand, enjoy them, learn about them, exist and enjoy the miracle of living. I don't understand this urge to dominate and take over. But while we're talking about Bill Gates, he's always struck me as a person who knows basically one thing. He knows how to sell computers by driving out the competition. He's never struck me as a knowledgeable or thoughtful person. He doesn't really even have the educational background that would allow him to manipulate a lot of these ideas, like how life on Earth works, or anything like that. The fact that he made billions and billions of dollars, mostly by suppressing and destroying competition, makes him think that he knows how to do a lot of other things. I don't see any evidence that he does know how to do a lot of other things in a thoughtful and constructive way. I see evidence that he knows how to drive other people out while feeding his ego that he's doing great things for the world, which are, on balance, in my opinion, pretty destructive things.
Carl, te quería preguntar.
Carl, can I ask you, when you listen to Vandana talk about the complexity of life, about the need to recover communities and the sense of community, when Vandana speaks about the liveliness of biodiversity of this small plot of land where many people, for example, can raise their own food. Now, what kind of parallelism can we draw between the words by Vandana and what you know about the behavior of animal communities, non-human animal communities? How much have we stopped learning or lost by not mimetizing ourselves with nature and with life that we belong to?
Well, I'm going to say two things that may sound contradictory. So I'll try to say very clearly. First of all, I would love to see more people employed well and with dignity in the creation of food. That is a trend that, generally, as we've been saying, the world is going generally against that trend. And I think that I would like to see the creation of food be something that is focused on creating dignity, communities, and good nutrition. On the other hand, every farm takes from the living world and simplifies a plot of land. Farmers are, to a greater or lesser extent, in competition with the natural world. They keep out a lot of things that were in that land and are trying to come back to that land. And that is the task of agriculture, as opposed to hunting and gathering, which is how humans existed for tens of thousands of years, over 100,000 years, purely by hunting and gathering. And that can support relatively small populations of human beings relatively well. Obviously, agriculture has enormous advantages for producing quantities of food. But there is this, we can improve the biodiversity of farms from the industrial farming that tries to kill everything, drenches them with pesticides, with petroleum-based fertilizers, and that kind of thing. We can move away from that back to something that is more biological, more biodiverse, much less harmful to the surrounding land. But as a person who is, involved and interested mainly in the extinction crisis that we have right now and the loss of biodiversity, ecological systems in any given area are much more complex than any farm can possibly aspire to be, because a farm has the mission of simplifying a place to focus on growing what human beings can eat. That is a simplifying function. Can that be brought into much better balance with the rest of the world than it is now? Yes, of course. Could we all be brought into much better balance if the human population overall was a lot less than it is? In 1800, there were probably 1/10 as many people as there are now. In my own lifetime, the human population of the world has tripled in my lifetime. Nobody ever said in 1800, the main problem we face is there aren't enough people. And certainly that's not the problem now. So I see this, dualistic sort of a problem. On the one hand, farming has been dehumanized and made into a very destructive force. On the other hand, farming is never in complete harmony with the rest of the world in the way that hunting and gathering is in complete harmony with the rest of the world, or almost as complete as you can have it and still have a human species in existence. So that's my perspective. My perspective is never to think only about what's good for people. We're doing terrible things for people right now. We could do so many things much better for people. But my overall perspective also includes the non-human. And in a sense, I'm concerned with all of those who do not have a voice in the major decisions that are driving what's happening in the world. And those decisions are largely very destructive of humanity, human dignity, and the rest of life on Earth, even though they are very successful at creating a situation in which more people can exist than ever before, and a few people are much richer than anybody has ever been before.
Vandana, ¿qué piensas respecto a lo que dice Carl?
Vandana, what do you think about what Carl is saying? I always have advocated for us focusing on the idea of gatherer-hunter human being, but the small-scale farmer human being, who I'm sure can live in harmony with nature, and furthermore can promote the growth of biodiversity, even of life cycles, or in any case, I would say that it's precisely farming and livestock raising activity that allows us to best position ourselves or be placed ourselves in harmony with the rest of the living beings. And what do you think about this?
You know, I don't see the evolution of humanity as hunting, gathering, destructive agriculture, but basically hunting, gathering, and farming like nature. So the British Empire sent Sir Albert Howard to India in 1905 to improve Indian agriculture for the empire to supply raw materials. He arrived, he found the soils were fertile. He found there were lots of insects, but no damage to the crops by pests. And as he writes in the book called An Agricultural Testament, which is called the Bible of Modern Organic Farming, which he learned from the peasants of India, he says, I could do no better than make the pest and the peasant my professor. And then he wrote the book about how you farm like nature. And he said, on the farms of India, farming is as permanent as the prairie, the forest, the ocean, because we learned from nature to farm according to nature's laws. And I hope someday, Carl, you'll be able to visit not just the traditional farms, but some of the farms we've regenerated, intensifying biodiversity. So at Navdanya, I save seeds. Our farms are basically conservation farms. We have 6 times more pollinator population on the farm than in the forest next door, because we have lots and lots of flowering plants. We've also seen how an invasive agriculture, which is the industrial agriculture, the GMO soya, is leading to the burning of the Amazon. And it's not a food system, it's a commodity system. In fact, it is leading to what is being called agri-suicide, because the Amazon creates its own rain. And now by destroying the rain, by the forests, rainforests, the rain is being destroyed and people are saying so which won't last long. But finally, for me, the most troubling part is, you know, when the tech barons are getting into food and lab food, they are feeding on a particular ignorance and separation with nature and living beings. And they are feeding on the assumption that any relationship of humans to non-human animals must be violent. And that is a misconception. I come from the land of the sacred cow. Where I'm sitting is what my mother gifted me in 1982 when I wanted to leave academics. And she said, don't worry, take the cowshed and start your own institution. I started the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology in this cowshed, which is now my library and my office. But if you read the literature of those making fake meat and fake food and fake tuna and fake salmon, then first of all, it's all patented, but they go on to talk about salmon which will not have brains and won't be swimming in the ocean. How can you decide that extinction of a species is non-violence to that species? And Carl, I hope you will work a bit on this unintended extinction by those who are promoting lab food, assuming that species will go extinct. And therefore you can accelerate that extinction. For me to take away the swimming capacity of the salmon and the tuna is taking away the intrinsic right to live freely of a fellow being. And it is violence.
Of course. Of course. Yes. I think in one sense, domesticating animals took away their right to live as they were made to live, as the world made them and as they came into the world. The intensification of that only makes that worse. And now what we are talking about doing, well, some people are talking about doing of, you know, as Vandana was just saying, creating salmon or tuna or things like that in, you know, in vats using just cell structures or cell cultures, kind of completes that annihilation. If it does result, in fact, in no reduction to the violence that is caused to the wild populations. I do think that there's an if to that. For instance, we have about half of the shrimp in the world are farmed, and about half or more than half of the salmon in the world are farmed. Most of those farms are destructive in various ways, but they have not reduced shrimp fishing and salmon fishing and the destruction of salmon rivers and the destruction of wetlands where shrimp live and breed. If there was a trade-off there, you could say, well, let's consider the trade-off, but they haven't made anything better. And that, I think, is a problem. But in the United States anyway, we do not generally shoot wild birds for food. In many other countries, people shoot and trap everything they possibly can for food. Why don't we? Why do we have a law against killing most wild birds that has caused most people to lose any interest in eating songbirds and things like that? Mostly because we raise billions of chickens. So although chicken farming is horrendous, there is a trade-off there between wild birds and chickens that I guess bears at least some examination. I would like to see us simply not eat wild birds and not farm chickens in factories. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think both of those things are they don't speak to the best in humanity, and the best in humanity is compassion. We are the animal with the most capacity for compassion. We very frequently do not exercise that capacity.
Y desde luego, si hablamos del sistema alimentario
And of
actual,
course, if we talk about the industrialized global food system, balance and compassion are two words that we don't ever see operating. As a matter of fact, in their crazy ideas, cows were fed with other cows. A herbivore animal was turned into a carnivore. And think about the mad cow disease. And even now, the salmons you're talking about that live in captivity in big farms, they're trying for them to eat soy. So at the end, a carnivorous animal is being turned into I don't know, a vegetable. It's really crazy. It makes no sense. It's wild.
One thing that could be mentioned, and I think it's an important part of salmon farming, is that where salmon farms occur, wild runs of salmon disappear. They seem to be incompatible. And the reason they seem to be incompatible is that the farms, because those fish are crowded together and they're always there in those pens, they are factories for parasites that kill the young wild salmon. So that the farms do, I was talking about the trade-off. Well, maybe if the farms let us stop killing the wild ones, we could have a conversation about the trade-offs. But especially in the case of salmon, it seems that the farms cause the elimination of the wild salmon just by the disease that they are constantly exporting.
Vandana nos ha enseñado mucho a todos y a todas sobre
Vandana has taught us a lot about the repercussions of monocultures where there's no balance, and the salmon breeding is in kind of monoculture, the industrial, because as Carl is saying, the parasites, its lies, propagate themselves just like our present-day pandemic and jumps over oceans and infects the wild salmon. One final question for the two of you, please. This has been very interesting, and we'll go back to the initial question, development versus food sovereignty. After listening to both of you, how can we build this myth of progress, of development in a way in which we now worship it as a monotheistic religion with this kind of ungrounded faith, but which one that still continues driving this world, the myth in the development, in progress, or the myth around progress, development, embedded into our own genetics, as it were.
So, Ivan Illich and Wolfgang Sachs and all of us wrote a book called The Development Dictionary, precisely to address how development had become a religion, basically in the post-war years. It's not an accident that, a group of institutions, World Bank, IMF, and initially the GATT were created to continue imperialism and colonialism at a time when countries were becoming free. So development is nothing but recolonization, just like corporate globalization is another recolonization. The word development comes from living systems, actually. A seed becoming a tree is development when structurally, in a self-organized way, it is enfolded in it, like in a quanta. There is an enfolding of the potential that will become that, whatever, the wave or the particle, the unfolding of the built-in self-organization of a fetus into an adult, a larvae into a butterfly, a seed into a wheat crop or a tree. This is development, a biological process of self-organization and self-evolution. As an industrial process, it becomes externally imposed for money making. You give $1, you make $3, is the studies that I did for World Bank. So how do we de-addict? Well, I think at one level, what we are going through right now, not just COVID, but the lockdown and the reset game that the billionaires have up their sleeves, they're anyway undoing this myth of progress, except for themselves, because they're writing off such large numbers that we cannot stay addicted to this illusion of the myth of progress. Food sovereignty is basically recognizing that we are interconnected beings, all of us sentient, all of us equal in a non-anthropocentric world. Our size doesn't decide how important we are. Our cultures don't decide. There is a world beyond anthropocentrism, and that world, the Earth family, I call it, is basically a world in which food moves from one species to the other, and moving in a non-toxic way and in a balanced way, in a fair way, is how the web of life is held together. Food sovereignty for me is no different from ecological regeneration. We've got to change our mind that food is about production of a commodity. Cultivating food is about cultivating the land and regenerating the soil, cultivating the biodiversity and regenerating the biodiversity, conserving water, and in the process, as my book Soil Not Oil shows, we actually even heal climate change. Every living system has the capacity to repair. Gaia as a whole system has a capacity to repair, but we have to work in alignment with her laws, not at war with her, which is how development and industrial agriculture have functioned. They function as war. This war must end. Now we must make peace with the earth and peace with ourselves as earth beings, working within the limits and increasing our well-being. And I know this is possible because the lockdown showed we can live differently.
Right, that was really beautifully said, really, really eloquent, and I can't really improve on that. One thing that has always struck me in any conversation about development is that there is an assumption that the idea of development is that we're going to improve things. If you look, there's really no plan, or you could say that the only plan is for a few people to make a lot of money. There's no plan to improve things for people. But people tend to equate the word development with the idea of improvement, but really it's about growth. It's about the idea that growth is always good and bigger is always better. But growth and improvement are not the same thing, and often they're completely at odds with one another. Growth means putting more material through a system to make it bigger. It doesn't imply anything about making it better. Improvement is about making it better. You do not need to have bigger schools to make schools better. You don't need bigger hospitals to make medical care better. You don't need bigger farms to make farming and food better. You don't need bigger cities to make communities better. Bigger is not the same as better, and often bigger and better are at odds. So when people equate development and growth with the implication that this is an improvement, they're wrong. What they're saying is not true. And we do need, as Vandana was so eloquently saying, we need a way to come back and circle around to recognize that the Earth system, the only thing that we have ever detected in the universe that is capable of life, has this regenerative capacity that is at its most basic, the most miraculous thing about it. It is self-renewing, self-regenerating. And the human enterprise is mostly a destruction course of that renewal and that regeneration, but it does not need to be that way. For 100,000 years or more, it was not that way. Humans were in complete harmony with the way that the earth has always been. The earth is not a great, wonderful place for everything. There's death, there's sickness, things come and go, change happens, it can be hard, but we're not making it easier. In many ways, we're making it much, much harder for the rest of life on earth and for billions of people. It doesn't need to be that way. We could get back to systems and economies that honored the regenerative, self-renewing aspect of life on earth and the dignity of human beings.
Muchas gracias, Carl. Muchas gracias, Vandana.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Vandana. We're going to say goodbye now. I would like to just share with you my impression after hearing your last comment. And it's about translating etymologically the word agriculture in Spanish. If we analyze that word and its etymology, it's all about, it means caring for the land. So probably that's a take-home lesson to obtain from this interesting conversation. Once again, Carl, Vandana, on behalf of the Culture Forum in Burgos, in Spain, thank you very much, and health.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.